Hello, everyone. Good morning to those in the United States. Good afternoon to those in Europe. I'm Tom Duesterberg, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and I have the privilege of moderating this important panel on WTO reform with an emphasis on the role of transatlantic relations. I want to start by thanking the Chatham House and the Hanns Seidel Foundation, the partners in this venture. This is a follow-on in certain respects to a two-day seminar in London at Chatham House late last fall on the same topic. I want to note at the outset that this meeting is being recorded and is on the record. We are going to feature today an important new contribution to the debate, a paper by Chatham House's Marianne Schneider-Petzinger, called Reforming the WTO, Prospects for Transatlantic Cooperation in the Global Trade System. This, of course, responds to a longstanding problem of WTO transparency, inability to complete a new round since the inception of the WTO in 1995, the need for new rules for the 21st century economy, challenges from the rise of China and growing populist critiques of the WTO, coupled now with the national inward-looking responses to the pandemic. All of these topics are covered in Marianne's paper, and we will have occasion to visit them today. Just a couple of rules for this seminar. We would like to make this interactive. After Marianne and our commentator, Mark Bush, have had a chance to make their interventions. So if you would like to ask a question in real time, use the raised hand function on Zoom. When you're recognized, please identify yourself and please make it a question without a long introduction. So we're going to start with the presentation by Marianne Schneider-Petzinger on her paper. She's a longtime fellow at Chatham House. She works on analysis and nexus of political and economic issues, specializes in transatlantic relations. She's had a good history in working in these fields, and we're very pleased to have her. We're going to have comments from Professor Mark Bush, who's the Karl Lomdeger Professor of International Diplomacy at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington. He's an expert on international trade policy and law. His podcast, Tradecraft, looks at current challenges in the global trading system, examines issues in a podcast on trade policy and law for iTunes and SoundCloud. He also writes a biweekly column for a widely read Washington journal, The Hill. So let's get started. Marianne, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for this kind introduction, Tom, and also thank you from me to the Hanns Seidel Foundation for partnering with Chatham House on this project of WTO reform. It's been a real pleasure to work on this project and also on this paper, which comes at a very important time. I think, we've had a long-standing discussion and efforts to reform the World Trade Organization, but the economic fallout from the global pandemic and also the increased politicization of trade tensions between the United States and China, but also Europe, I think have made reforming the WTO an even more urgent task. Now, in my paper, I think I focus on two arguments. The first one is that WTO really has come under pressure across all three of its functions, and to modernize the organization, reform has to happen across all three functions at the same time. The second argument is that transatlantic cooperation is necessary for WTO reform, but it's not a sufficient condition. So perhaps, taking a step back and breaking it down one by one, let's start with the make or break moment that the WTO is currently facing. The WTO, as I mentioned before, is serving three main functions: to serve as a forum to liberalize trade and establish new rules, to oversee and monitor those rules, and then lastly, to help WTO members settle their disputes. And even before COVID-19, all of those functions were under pressure. The WTO Appellate Body, for instance, lost its quorum of 3 members to hear any new appeals in December of last year. That's because the US blocked the appointments process. But it's also important to understand that this isn't new. And in fact, it was the Obama administration that first blocked the reappointment of a WTO Appellate Body member in 2011. The US grievances are well known. They're long-standing. They've been raised across the political aisle. They're also shared by many other WTO members around the world, but few share the US's tactics of blocking the appointments process to the appellate body. And in order to address the paralysis of the appellate body, there's been a number of reform efforts. They have involved the European Union. There's also been efforts between the United States, the EU, and Japan to tackle some of the issues that specifically are limited and addressed by China that spill over into WTO reform efforts. There's been the Walker proposals within the WTO General Council, but I think all of those have so far failed to address the US's concerns and interim solutions. For example, the EU's and others, and it's now up to 23 WTO members, their interim appeal arbitration arrangement actually has many, many shortcomings. It's an important step, but again, a quick fix in the short term. It does potentially undermine reform efforts to actually fix the appellate body in the long term. And if it remains in place in the long term, it also creates the risk of a fragmentation of the rules-based system. Now, the key point, I think, is that all of those efforts that are focused solely on reforming the appellate body miss the larger point, and that is that the crisis of the dispute settlement system is really closely linked to a breakdown of the negotiating form that the WTO provides. WTO members have failed to bring the most recent round of multilateral trade negotiations, the so-called Doha round, to successful conclusion. The talks broke down. There have been parts of it that have been, kind of harvested, but for the most part, the round has failed. And what we've seen in the interim is really a proliferation of bilateral and regional free trade agreements led by the United States and the European Union, but we've over 300 bilateral and regional free trade agreements currently in force. It's up from 60 that we had in 1995. Now, there's been a long-standing debate to what extent this has been a stepping stone or perhaps a stumbling block for the multilateral system, but I think really the way forward will be in plurilateral agreements. Now, plurilateral agreements, they involve a subset of WTO members and are usually focused on a specific sector of the economy. That's different from multilateral agreements that really cover all 164 WTO members. Plurilateral agreements, they still, are not perfect. They still require compromise, and they also raise important issues of, what are the benefits extended to non-members. But I think they are quite critical to advance trade negotiations into areas where it's currently impossible to reach consensus among all WTO members. And here I think it's quite positive that we've seen e-commerce negotiation launched by over 75 WTO members. And there's other areas that I think are really ripe to move forward, particularly since there's a lot of areas of the WTO that have not kept pace with the changed trade landscape, in particular in technology, but also with regards to China's increased role in the global economy and China's model of state capitalism. So going forward, I think the approach of flexible multilateralism that uses plurilateral agreements to move forward negotiations at the same time as still moving forward multilateral areas where that is possible is going to be a good complement. But none of that really can be solved without also addressing some institutional issues such as the long-standing debate around developing country status and the special and differential treatment that comes along with that. And here the key issue is that there is no agreed definition of what constitutes a developing countries at the WTO. And really, it's no surprising that 2/3 of WTO members then self-declare themselves as developing countries and get special treatment for phasing in their tariff schedules, for example. Another linked element there is that there has to be an improvement to the notification and transparency obligations of WTO members. And in this regard, again, it's quite notable to actually see that the US has put forth proposals and is engaged. So even though the US has been quite forceful in its criticism of the WTO, there are areas where the US is still quite active, and that I think presents an opportunity for other WTO members, in particular the EU, to engage. Which leads me to the second argument of the paper, which is that, as I've mentioned, transatlantic cooperation is a necessary but not sufficient condition for WTO reform. So if the US and the EU cannot work together bilaterally, then WTO reform is very, very unlikely. But at the same time, that requires that the underlying trade tensions between the major trading parties are resolved. That's between the United States and China, but also with regards to the United States and European Union. Just think of the Boeing-Airbus dispute, for example, or digital taxation, which is increasingly becoming a contentious issue. But at the same time, as the United States and Europe share many of the same concerns regarding China, I think there has to be a way to make sure that China is at the table and that China is involved in updating the rules so that ultimately there is a way to accommodate two very different economic systems, that of China's state capitalism and that of the West's market economies. I think that will be really the task for the WTO going forward. So just to sum up, I think for a transatlantic agenda for WTO reform, reforming the appellate body needs to be a critical part, even though currently there is large differences that remain. But at the same time, the United States and Europe also need to focus on new rules that are fit for 21st century trade, including e-commerce, digital trade, and addressing the shared concerns vis-a-vis China. I leave it there for my opening remarks, but we're really happy to discuss anything in more detail in the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Marianne. Over to Mark, and please, all of you in the audience, think of questions you would like to raise. Use the raised hand function, and after Mark completes his remarks and the two respond to each other, we can recognize people for questions. So Mark, over to you.
Thanks very much. Let me try and start at 34,000 feet and frame the issue from there. Do we still believe that the WTO is a viable means of allowing us to reach our economic and political goals, despite the fact that it does come at the cost of the ability to wield measures that are going to relieve domestic political pressure over free trade? That's the big picture. And one thing that isn't taken up in the paper is that this is increasingly being expressed not just by the United States, but by a lot of countries through national security issues. So it's true that the US has triggered an awful lot of litigation in the WTO with its Section 232, but the reality is that in the committees, you're seeing almost every country find some reason to invoke national security for what they're doing. Having been a cleared advisor to USTR for 6 years on the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee, I can tell you that we saw this nonstop. And it is unrelenting, and it is remarkable how heterogeneous the group is that's making use of national security. I appreciate Marianne's points about things like special and differential treatment and who is a developing country. I'm frustrated by the tone in the media that there are countless woes with the WTO. It's easy to pick apart an institution of this sort and to find fault with a variety of things. I don't like the run and gun approach to this. I do believe that there's one major issue that has to be addressed, and that's the issue of precedent. We aren't going to get reform in terms of dispute settlement until we engage this, and I'm sorely discouraged by the lack of creativity expressed to this moment by the members on this issue. And keep in mind that since 2001, we have had dispute settlement reform efforts underway. The number one item to date has been third-party rights. It has not been precedent. Precedent has gotten all of 3 paragraphs in submissions. Maybe there's some strategic logic whereby you wait out to the last moment, but no one's taking it up. What I would like to suggest is, and I know that Chatham House will be submitting to everyone my podcast on a design feature to help reconcile this. It is a kind of geeky approach, and I held myself to one set of circumstances, namely, I wanted to build a mechanism that only uses things that are already in existence. But I do believe that this can be addressed, and I do believe that we have the kernels of a solution already coming up in WTO litigation. So to get to WTO litigation, let me just concede that Marianne's actually absolutely right. The plurilaterals will likely be the foreseeable future in terms of any negotiation. As someone who was on the TBT committee, let me also agree that notification is an issue. We in the United States have always complained about failure to notify. Even on the part of devout free traders like Chile, we in the United States believe that many countries fall short in terms of notification. It's a big problem. Now let's focus on the appellate body. I am loath to think that trade remedies could be leading to the impasse at the moment, but that's really where we are. And it's trade remedies that will dictate the future. And if it's needed that we, like Jennifer Hillman has suggested, come up with a separate review mechanism for trade remedies, so be it. Politically, there's no rocket science in trade remedies, so I'm horrified to imagine that that's how we'll cast that reform effort. But if we need to come up with something separate for trade remedies, let's do it. Here's the issue. Is precedent the equivalent of judicial activism? That's fundamentally the question that has to be addressed in appellate body reform. I say no. We can have precedent in a hard or a soft version, the hard version being what we read from the appellate body in US stainless steel from Mexico, the soft version being what we read from the appellate body in Japan alcohol too. Notice that the US loves in all of its submissions right now the logic of Japan alcohol too. There's a reason for that. Precedent is, in my view, really important, absolutely necessary, and I have yet to see a single US official explain how it is that we would litigate a WTO case without banking on something pretty close to hard precedent. It's just something that baffles me to this day. I believe in strong precedent because that's what predictability and stability flow from. Business needs it, governments need it. And when we mock up a case, we do hard precedent. Let's just be honest. We do hard precedent. So if it really comes down to judicial activism, great. Now we're on the verge of a solution because the WTO also doesn't like judicial activism. I draw your attention to Article 3.2 of the Dispute Settlement Understanding, which we all affectionately know as the Add to or Diminish Clause. The WTO doesn't agree that we should have judicial activism, and we shouldn't. The problem is that we have no mechanism to keep in check judicial activism that runs afoul of DSU 3.2. But let's stop confusing that with precedent. They're not the same thing. We can have strong guidance in the form of received wisdom from appellate body decisions and not have judicial activism. We know that, moreover, from the very case at the center of this discussion, namely US stainless steel from Mexico. The US offers in its first submission of that litigation the notion that something called cogent reasons are to be potentially found to deviate from received appellate body wisdom. If there's one item on which the US and the EU should be building a transatlantic consensus on, it is something called cogent reasons. Is it in the text? No, but Europe popularized it in its third-party submissions in 2 very high-profile cases, the stainless steel case from Mexico and US differential pricing methodology with respect to Canada. We need a review mechanism. So in brief, here's my review mechanism. One dissenting appellate body jurist triggers a review by a group of appellate body jurists who aren't hearing the case, could well be retired, could well be hanging out in Geneva, and they remand a decision if they believe the ruling has run afoul of add to or diminish. That, in a nutshell, is my proposal. It's not the only one that could be done, but whatever is done, it has to separate out judicial activism from precedent. Our discussion to date over precedent has been unhelpful, and it is quite startling that Europe could only muster a single paragraph on precedent a year before the collapse of the appellate body. The US has yet to say what it doesn't like about precedent in any meaningful detail, and has yet to offer us an alternative as to what it would be in the context of any given litigation. I mean, think about it. We have panels in the appellate body that cite the Oxford Dictionary. What are we talking about in terms of rebutting guidance? We look for guidance all the time. If everything is a de novo experience, then we have no predictability and no stability. So I would urge that this all be reined in. Let me end with one last comment. Marianne starts her paper with COVID-19, and I agree. There's nothing about COVID-19 that has brought any of this to the fore. All of it's been in motion since at least 2001. What I think is the necessary angle to take now with COVID-19 is, this is the answer to the question I started with. Are we willing to bet on efficiency for the sake of a global economy, or are we looking for outs to appease any and all domestic demands for relief from imports? What I like about COVID-19 is that it has focused attention on reshoring supply chains. And the beauty is that everyone is beginning to realize they can't do it. Not a single country can reshore a medical supply chain. And they've begun to realize that even in theory, to pull that off, they'd have to do things on intellectual property, on training scientists, on domestic regulatory issues that they cannot do anytime soon. Even the best estimates for the United States, the largest exporter of patented drugs on earth, is that you couldn't even reshore active pharmaceutical ingredients for over a decade. So if we're going to use COVID-19 as a launch for something, let's use it as a launch for discussing the fact that it's putting the lie to the reinvigorated look at autarky, at least for essential products and essential medical supplies in particular. The WTO can be reformed, but let's rein in the expectations, and I'm going to end on this note. Expectations are too high. And the next Director General of the WTO will have to manage expectations better than the media are doing right now. There's no magic answer to China. We can debate public body, but even our answers to public body as a subsidy issue and our answers to precedent aren't the kinds of things that our electorates are looking to hear about. But they are the stuff of reform. Reform isn't going to be sexy. And it's not going to answer any grand macro issue. So let's rein in the expectations and let's stop this run and gun approach to listing all the would-be woes inherent in the design of the WTO. And let's realize that it works pretty damn good. How do we know? Look at how countries are cheating. They're all using workarounds like national security because the institution works. Thanks.
Okay, Mark, thanks. Very provocative. I wonder, Marianne, if you would like to respond to Mark's suggestion or comment on Mark's suggestion regarding the appellate body. And since we're a little bit down in the technical details, I'd also like to ask both of you how you think the plurilateral agreement suggestion would work within the context of existing WTO rules. Do we need a supermajority of trade to be involved in creating these plurilaterals? Let's take one example. The existing rules allow plurilaterals for services writ large. That covers a lot of territory. Is it conceivable that we could get a supermajority of trade represented in a negotiation? And the second part of that is, do we need a ministerial decision to incorporate plurilateral rules, open plurilateral rules, as Marianne suggests, into the corpus of the WTO? And finally, can China block that if they choose to? For instance, if we have a plurilateral specifying more on subsidies, just to take one example. So Marianne?
Yes, no, thank you very much to Mark for comments on the paper, and additional kind of building out his own proposal for reforming the appellate body, which is quite interesting. I think, really teasing out a difference between precedent and judicial activism is quite important. But, I'm also very much struck by, how that could feed into Ambassador Lighthizer recent op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, which very much made the case that there should only be a single stage of ad hoc panels and no presidential impact, and that there should still be some kind of mechanism, he didn't spell out exactly what it would look like, to set aside any concerns of perhaps erroneous panel opinions in exceptional cases, whatever that means. But I think there is, to some extent, perhaps an opening there where there could be this proposal of setting aside the kind of remand that's initiated by the WTO appellate body itself in a kind of small deviation from Ambassador Lighthizer's proposal of sticking to a single stage. Perhaps, again, some middle ground to be found there. The second element that Mark touched upon, and which I wanted to pick up again, is the issue of COVID-19 and what it means for the reconfiguration of supply chains, but also I think really the question of subsidies. And in the short term, what we've seen so far is more, interventions to keep the economy floating, for example. It's less industrial policies, but I think there could still be a wave of trade disputes that are very much centered on trade remedies if there is an asynchronous recovery and countries, recover at different times, and we move those subsidies asymmetrically, and other countries then arguing that the remaining subsidies are trade and market destroying. So I think there could be potentially a wave of cases at the WTO centered on trade remedies in the wake of COVID-19. If that is not addressed in the short term, I think that could undermine any WTO reform efforts. But it's also linked to the larger question of efforts to reshore and reconfigure supply chains, and that really specifically more in the area of a new era of industrial policy. And I think there, US efforts, for example, to support the semiconductor industry domestically has the potential to look at essentially being hypocritical, and the US kind of calling China out on those practices at the same time that the US is introducing similar measures at home. Thirdly, the larger issue of reform and being realistic about what we're calling for, realistic also in the terms of a potential time frame. But I want to add to that in order for the WTO to remain relevant, it also has to tackle issues such as climate change or sustainability more broadly. And that leads to the broader question of, what is that balance between linking trade and non-trade issues? If the issue linkage is too weak and the WTO doesn't really address those issues of sustainability, for example, then really it's not relevant in terms of being able to help with some of the most pressing challenges that we're facing. But at the same time, if the WTO tries to do too much, then that risks that an already overburdened organization and its members are just gonna really be overwhelmed and fall apart. So getting that balance right, I think, going forward is critical. And that, I think, is really where also plurilateral efforts can play a role. And to get around some of the issues of, consensus and tackling issues that are not quite ripe yet to move forward with all 164 members. But to answer Tom's questions in terms of how would you structure those plurilaterals, there's really two ways to go about that. One way is to have them as open plurilateral agreements, where essentially the signatories of that agreement extend the benefits to all of the other members. That potentially risks free riding. And so here, to really avoid that, you have to have a critical mass, which is usually kind of defined as 90% of world trade for that particular sector, for example. The other way to structure plurilateral is to have it more a club approach, meaning it's more exclusive so that the benefits of that agreement are only for the signatories. But that also raises some challenges of its own, which could potentially lead to a fragmentation of the trade rules going forward. Now, adding to that is also that a number of plurilateral agreements are taking place outside of the WTO framework. And here in particular, the Trade and Services Agreement, for example, is a case in point. That is, 23 parties, they're WTO members, but they're negotiating outside of the WTO with the hope of later bringing it back formally under the WTO umbrella and multilateralizing it down the road. I think going forward, the key element is really that any plurilateral efforts have to be open in such a way that other countries can join and that the rules are expanded to countries that then join later. I think that to me is really the most important element that has to be kept in consideration.
Okay, Mark, any quick comments to add to that?
You bet. First, we didn't invent plurilaterals during the WTO. Let's not forget bovine meat or dairy or aircraft. They were around during GATT. We can continue to do them the way that we do. I don't think there's any real big institutional hurdle to getting plurilaterals right. On services, we did it because we allowed countries by mode of supply to have MFN and national treatment limitations. That wasn't viable, and you got what you got. The irony is that there's only one agreement that we don't talk about during COVID-19, and that's the 1995 pharmaceutical agreement requiring countries to go to zero tariffs. I think it's scandalous how many countries have, to this day, big tariffs on pharmaceuticals. It's also shocking that the average tariff on soap is 17%. Please don't ask the WTO to do climate change. My God, the institution works for a reason. Let's recognize its strengths and not ask it to do things that it has no business doing. You correct problems that are inherent in the goal of the institution. You want a climate change deal, do a climate change deal, but please don't saddle the WTO with the so-called social issues. We have enough to worry about, and moreover, it's the developing countries that are going to push back. It's India that said going into the Doha round that labor and the environment were disguised protection on trade. The final point I'll make, Tom, is that no one needs precedent more than the United States. No one. And the US, despite what you may think about the current impasse, is going to have to, within the next year, file two very big cases in agriculture. One against the European Union and one against China. We can't win if you don't believe in precedent. It's that simple. So for offensive litigation reasons, we believe in precedent in the United States, and inshallah, the next administration will allow us to talk intelligently once again. But if you want to think about the ultimate harm that has been done to the WTO of late, it is US first submission on Section 301 litigation filed by China. The fact that the United States has invoked GATT 20A as an exception shows you how low things have gotten. And it is for this reason, when we think about reform, don't take on new mandates. Just do what you do well.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Let's go to first Leslie Vinjamuri of Chatham House, then to Peter Rashish on the other side of the Atlantic.
So
Leslie.
it's a delight to watch this. It's good to see you again, Mark, after all these years. I've been following your work for a very long time. And Marianne, what a phenomenal report and just tremendous work across the board for several years here at Chatham House, leading the way on trade. So I have this is not what I follow on a daily basis. So my questions are not leading questions. They are just questions. Two quick questions and a quick comment. One is on, Mark, you set it up as, and I'm very interested in Marianne's reaction to this as well on the supply chains question, reshoring versus autarky. Watching this as an insider outsider, it strikes me that the interesting debate is in the middle ground, and you seem to set it up as an artificial binary. So, what is there anything in the middle ground that you think is interesting in terms of reshoring that isn't about autarky? And who's leading it? Is this just talk? Right? National security talk by whoever, pundits? Is it firms that are leading? I mean, what's your estimation of what's going on and how far it is or isn't going to go? I can see you don't think it's going to go very far. On the national security, this is, again, a genuine question. You said there's so many cases where national security justification is used. Is there a pattern? When the US uses this, do you see an acceleration of, does it lead to more use of the national security justification more than when others do? What's the trend? What's driving it? I'm very curious about that. And where did it start? And what are the spikes? And I'm curious, Marianne's thought on that general, what is the implication of using that justification? And then just a comment, your proposal is very clever. When there's one dissenting judge, send it to an external panel. It just strikes me as, wow. Do you think do you think you can get consensus on that? I mean, that strikes me as, it's already so hard to solve the existing problem. Are we really going to get consensus on a whole external panel of judges that would vet decisions and states would be held accountable? I'm just curious if you think is this something that you see actually getting traction in the real world?
Well, let me take those in reverse order. The dissent idea is something that I really didn't want to have to emphasize in the mechanism's design. I'm not big on dissent in terms of appellate body rulings, but we get them. So we work with them. And I'd rather make it a positive than a negative. The remand function, though, does not require consensus. It just requires a remand. It asks questions. I don't know that they have to necessarily have unanimity to remand a decision. But remember what we're talking about. The average WTO case is 8 legal claims. We're not talking about a ruling per se. We're talking about a logic. And even in our instances of dissenting opinions, the one very famous dissent was with respect to the means by which the appellate body came to its conclusion, not the conclusion. On the national security side, I was involved in the Qatar versus Saudi Arabia on IP, where Saudi Arabia's only legal defense was national security with respect to stealing digital content from Qatar. That follows on the heels of DS 512, Russia traffic in transit. Both cases have left the WTO in a weird position. The WTO has said that it can review emergencies international law. The question then becomes, largely because of the brilliant third-party submission by the European Union, what's the nexus between the level of national security being pursued and the measure being instituted to get there? The US has definitely committed an unforced error here by teaching the world how to do this. There's no two ways about it. And it's going to pick up before it dissipates. So we always knew that as soon as something like this happened, you would get a learning effect that would come back to haunt the United States. And if you think about China, for example, on the local content requirements for information in services, there you go. That's going to hurt the US on the offense, and we taught them how to do it. So that's a big problem. On finally, the issue of reshoring, I do like to frame it as being on a continuum between what we have today and then I see pure autarky and reshoring as kind of the same. Would there be something shy of that? I would hope so, Leslie. I definitely would. And let me just offer you an example. Canada. Canada's reaction to COVID-19 at first was, let's reshore a lot. We'll do our own masks, our own ventilators, our own drugs. And then Canada had to confess, you know what? We can't do it. It's not just that Canadians won't pay the price. for reshored masks or reshored ventilators. It's that we honestly can't go it alone in pharma, but no one can. Industry is horrified by this. As someone who has been working with industry on this exact issue, let me just say, industry is horrified by the prospect that governments are getting carried away. And here in the United States, we have something on the line of 8 different bills ready for congressional review on reshoring. We have 4 amendments on top of that. So you've got a lot of action coming down the pike, and it's all bad. It's bad commercially. And thank goodness we have several countries now that have shown the way. You've got Singapore and Australia and New Zealand leading a merry band of the coalition of the willing, promising not to impede the flow of goods up and down medical supply chains. They're the way forward, not the reshoring.
But just to add to that, I think there is also, other areas that shouldn't be ignored, just increased diversification, redundancy, stockpiling. So I think there's a whole package of things that can be undertaken to strengthen supply chains. And then in particular, also emphasis of increased regionalization. And I think there is an area for the United States and trusted partners, including the European Union, to work together on thinking through and taking steps to reinvigorate supply chains across the Atlantic. To some extent, that will have to be driven by firms. So it's not going to be, governments that kind of make those decisions for firms, particularly on the question of, decoupling from China, because firms do want to have access to the Chinese market, not just to kind of use that as an export springboard, but to actually also have access to the domestic market in China. So I don't see a huge wave of firms kind of exiting China. But again, I think where governments can play a role is to increase and provide incentives, whether that's through tax incentives, for example, or subsidies, to encourage firms to take steps that help to diversify and to shorten supply chains for those critical goods. Now, it's also a huge question of what should those critical goods be. There's been a lot of emphasis on PPEs, on food in the wake of COVID, but I think also increasingly forward, that will have to be, again, also rare earths, for example, or any kind of needed materials for the EU, for example, to deliver on its climate ambitions.
Okay, I think we have a question from Peter Rashish.
Good morning. Thanks, Tom. And also thanks to the Hanns Seidel Foundation and to Chatham House for organizing this event. I wanted to pick up on the issue of plurilaterals. Mariana, you said that the risk with what you call the club approach would be that it could lead to fragmentation in trade rules. But it seems to me that we already have a fragmentation of trade rules because of the proliferation of free trade agreements, because WTO rules sometimes are insufficient and sometimes they're just absent. So if that's the case, how should we look at plurilaterals? I mean, do you think we should look at them essentially as a way for like-minded countries to gain leverage vis-a-vis China? Or do you think that they should be looked at as a more efficient way to also include China from the start?
I think that depends very much on the topic. If you take the example of the environmental goods agreement, for example, that was envisioned as a plurilateral agreement, but because of some concerns that China has raised and also actions by the US and others, it didn't come to fruition. But I think, taking the example of e-commerce, for example, I mean, here you have India, which really is, one of the key drivers of e-commerce, choosing not to be at the table, which then raises question to what extent such an agreement on e-commerce, for example, can really be and lead the way forward. And to stick to the example of e-commerce, it's great that we have the US, for example, the EU and China engaged in those negotiations, but the approach to kind of privacy is so different between the United States and China, but also between the United States and Europe, that any deal will require compromise. So just saying, we're moving forward on plurilaterals isn't going to solve the issue, that it still requires negotiations, it still requires compromise to be found. But again, I would say that it really depends on the issues at stake, to what extent China needs to be at the table. But as I mentioned at the beginning, China is the most important trading nation. So to really, have leverage, China needs to be engaged in those discussions so that the United States and Europe together, but also with Japan, can use those talks to get China to agree. But then obviously the critical point is also how those rules get enforced.
Okay, thank you, Marianne. We have a number of other questions. We've got about 10 minutes left. So why don't we take about 3 questions and then give you, Marianne, and Mark a chance to answer. Let's go first to Marianne Crowley, then to Andreas Escher, then to Alan Beatty.
Hi, Marianne and Mark. So thanks to both of you. I thought your remarks were very interesting. I was very interested in what Mark said, and I wanted to ask, just to clarify, so I like the idea that there could be a further review of AB reports to sort of assess whether or not there's been some issue of judicial activism. And so what I didn't understand is, are you saying that if an AB report does clearly show some work that goes beyond the text of the treaty, are you suggesting that future panels and AB reports would just not recognize any precedents that would be set by the judicially activist stance taken? And more specifically, I'm wondering if you think this is a useful level of review to have for trade remedies, because one of the ways I view trade remedies rules in the GATT is essentially incomplete. It's very easy to violate them in various ways. We see a lot of stuff happening in subsidies and countervailing duties that look like countries are just trying to get around the rules so that they can have some type of policy domestically or some sort of trade barrier. And so it strikes me that if we don't have countries coming together to negotiate new trade remedies rules, you can't really have very effective reports in some cases unless the AB just sort of makes up some future rules with some kind of judicially activist position. So I just wondering, how do you think this could work in practice? Could we really apply it to trade remedies, or is that just something that we've got to just work through negotiating more clarity about what countries want?
Hi, Meredith. Nice to talk to you again. Great that this opportunity arose for us to chat. Listen, I'm fine with the idea that we spin off trade remedies, but to your question, I want the remand to give it back to the appellate body to finesse the issue at hand. And then that becomes part of the jurisprudence that is rendered by the appellate body. So I don't see that part of the disconnect. But in terms of what you're mentioning about trade remedies, look, I agree that there are many multiple equilibria problems suggested by the incomplete nature of the text on trade remedies. But let's also not take this too seriously, in as much as here in the United States, Meredith, as you know better than I do, we are getting pretty damn creative with our particular market situations. And I gotta say that we know what these things are supposed to do. Canada designed them in 1904 for a reason. They are to alleviate political concern about a commercial policy. And I just don't think that the bar should be that we write the perfect text. We're never going to get there because of everyone's particularities with respect to how they do it. I just would urge, though, that if this is the price for reconstituting the appellate body, let's do it. Spin off trade remedies. Let the trade remedies people have their own little world.
Okay, thanks. Could we sort of do a lightning round here? We have at least 3, possibly 4 questioners left. Why don't we go to each in turn, then try to have both speakers respond as quickly as possible. So we have Andreas, we have Alan Beatty, we have David Hennig, and perhaps Peter Unfakorn, but I think Peter may have just signed off. So why don't we go to Andreas, Alan, and David, then turn to the panelists for response.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Excellent panel. Question is, apart from these big functions of WTO, how far, that's my puppy, I'm sorry, how far could organizational reforms, internal reforms improve things? How far could the Secretariat play a different role in a different way? What would be needed? Could it be institutional learning, evaluation of practices, and so on? And how far could other international institutions like IMF or OECD or so come up as a role model for the necessary change? Thanks.
We should go to Alan or David.
Hi, it's Alan here. Political economy question. There seems to be quite a big shift in the rest of the WTO membership. Leading candidates for the DG, and Ngozi and Amina have both said they accept quite a lot of it. Even the EU has signalled fairly strongly, if privately, that they're moving towards the US position. If there's a more kind of traditional US critique, if there's a Biden administration, how much space do you think remains between the sort of the bulk consensus of the rest of the WTO membership and what the US administration would require in order to unblock the appellate body?
So let's go to David or Peter.
Hi, it's David. Hi, it's almost a follow-on from that. Is it possible to fix the WTO while the EU and the US continue to have such major differences over trade elements? And actually, you know, Alan is almost on optimistic territory there by suggesting that the EU might be moving towards the US view on the appellate body, but there's so many divisions in areas like agriculture. Can we, you know, is it really feasible that, you know, the EU and the US come together and help fix the WTO?
So finally, Peter.
Thank you. I put some comments in the chat. I'd just like to answer a question about plurilaterals. Apart from the difference between open and closed or club type plurilaterals, there's an important distinction between those that make commitments that can simply be scheduled, and then it's a unilateral act to schedule those, and those that are rulemaking, which may need to be subject to dispute settlement. And if that's the case, they have to be annexed to the WTO agreements, and that probably requires consensus. So adding rulemaking plurilaterals to the WTO body of agreements may be a lot more complicated.
Okay, thanks very much for the questions and the comments. Let's go to Marianne for answers to this lightning round of questions.
Excellent set of questions and interventions. I guess starting with the first one by Andreas on organizational reform. I mean, first of all, the WTO members now have to select the next Director General. That will be a key challenge, even though obviously the role of the Director General is quite limited because ultimately it's a member-based and member-driven organization. But I think in terms of other steps to improve the organization, you know, some proposals have focused on limiting the terms that staff of the Secretariat, for example, can spend in a particular area to bring in some fresh thinking, for example, and I think that could be a very welcome step. But in terms of, you know, institutional reform, some of the principles that the WTO is based on, such as, you know, decisions taken by consensus or single undertaking, which means, you know, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Those are very long standing and there hasn't been a lot of progress on that front. But I think the shift towards plurilaterals kind of, you know, sidesteps some of those issues. Now, with regards to Ellen's points about the US position and other WTO members, in particular the EU, potentially moving more into that field, again, the concerns by the US are long-standing, they're shared, but there is huge concern about the tactics. And here I don't think the EU would really support the US's steps of continuing the blockage of appellate body members. And there I think the US election in November will really kind of show the way forward. The Biden administration, for example, you know, could take steps, but I think the most important part there is, particularly when it comes to the appellate body, that the US actually spells out its reform proposal of its own. Because so far, the US has just raised concerns without making clear what it wants to see or what would be acceptable. So I think that could be a very concrete step that a Biden administration, for example, could take. Now, with regards to David's question on US-EU cooperation necessary to fix the WTO, again, that goes back to my key argument, which that it's a necessary condition that the US and the EU cooperate, and that requires some of those underlying trade tensions to be removed. Again, that perhaps is more likely under a Biden administration if you're seeing some of the critical tensions with regards to the US's imposition of steel and aluminum tariffs, for example, if those are removed, or also with regards to digital taxation, if the US under Biden administration, for example, fully recommits to move those discussions forward at the level of the OECD. So in a sense, to really focus on the shared concerns that the US and the European Union have, and to manage those areas of policy divergence outside in other fora, for example, the OECD.
Thank you. Over to Mark. I know you have to get to a class, but hopefully you can make a comment on a few of these.
Lightning answer in response to lightning questions. Let me just put it this way, words matter, and let's choose our words carefully. I wish the membership and the media would both stop just conceding that the institution is imperfect. It is, but it works well, and let's be very careful about the language that we use to describe both the problem and would-be solutions. And in this regard, let's start managing the expectations of the polities that claim to be members of the institution writ large. There's no big magic answer coming in the form of reform, and we've got to get our publics ready for that. And I gotta say, for those of you across the Atlantic who are waiting for magic with a Biden victory, good luck. Because the institution is in trouble regardless of the outcome in November. And that's why everybody has to hold the United States to account in explaining exactly what the problem is and exactly what it wants. But no one needs the WTO more than the United States needs it. Let's hope that that memory comes back into vogue.
Okay, Mark, thanks very much. Thanks to our author, Marianne, for an excellent contribution. Thanks to the audience for a number of really great questions. Again, thanks to Chatham House and Hanns Seidel Foundation for sponsoring this event and this paper. So let's hope for the best in the next few months.
Thank you all again for your contributions. And the paper is available on the Chatham House website. We'll also be sending it as a link. So please feel free to share and comment. Welcome really any feedback and particular suggestions or questions.